Chapter 52, A Night Out. Cedric was chopping at the counter as Ruby walked by. With a small grin on her face, she stood behind him and poked him in the shoulder. The weasel's ears twitched as he turned around. Wah! His eyes widened. You. He pointed his knife at her, frowning. Stay the hell away from me. Ruby put on an innocent look. What's wrong? She asked. What did I do? I just wanted to have a nice, friendly chat with you. Maybe in the back alley. Cedric looked incredulous. No fucking way. I'm going to stay right here in front of all these people, so you think twice about whatever you're going to do, you psycho bitch. Geez, okay, Ruby said as she backed off. You didn't have to be so rude. The weasel didn't respond as he stared at her, keeping an eye on her until she backed off to a safe distance before returning to his work. Ruby spent the rest of the lunch hours washing the dishes, cleaning them as they came in. By the time the customers had left, Ruby only had a few plates left. She finished cleaning them and wiped her hands down, watching as the other employees sat down and grabbed some leftover food. Rowan was wiping down the tables when Ruby went into the dining room. She watched him clean for a few minutes before speaking up. Do we have a lunch break now? Rowan looked up and nodded. We get an hour or so to eat and do other things. I usually just stay here and eat some food, although sometimes I wander around town a bit. Ruby thought for a moment. Great, she exclaimed as she stood up and removed her apron. See you in an hour. Rowan looked confused. Wait, where are you going? Ruby folded the apron and set it on the counter. Places to be, things to do, she said vaguely as she quickly walked out of the door. She began jogging the moment she left the restaurant, steadily increasing her pace as she neared the outskirts of the town. The sun was high in the sky and the air was clear as she ran back to Maya's place. Because the path was so rarely used by anyone, Ruby was able to sprint as quickly as she could, her boots crunching into the snow and sending shards of ice flying up as she ran forward. The wall of the town quickly loomed up ahead, the wooden structure soaring into the sky as she drew close to it. Ruby took out her keys, unlocked the door, and entered Maya's house. Maya wasn't home yet, no one responding when Ruby called her name. The clock showed Ruby that she still had plenty of time left, her mad dash having allowed her to reach the house incredibly quickly. Ruby leapt down the basement steps, her boots thumping on the wooden stairs as she landed in a crouch at the bottom. She slid open the wall panel, taking the safe key out of her pocket and unlocking the safe as quickly as she could. She took the bundle out of the safe, unwrapping her ragged cloak as she did so, and took out just the side. After she had replaced the bundle and relocked the safe, she began unfolding her side, running up the stairs as the side would open. The kitchen shutters were still open, so she jumped onto the windowsill and climbed onto the roof. No guards were near the top of the wall, so Ruby began carving. She created tiny cutouts in the wall with her scythe to give herself a way of climbing without needing to rely on her weapon, making sure that they weren't too visible from a distance. By the time she was done, Ruby estimated that she only had a little time left before she had to run back to the restaurant. She quickly flipped herself over the ramparts and onto the walkway, folded up her scythe, and looked out at the landscape. Her plan was to scope out the wall during her lunch break so that she could devote at least part of her time toward doing her job of protecting the wall. She didn't expect much, of course, and she was sure that the guards in the guard towers would probably see the grim before she did, but at least this way she was actually physically doing something. The snow was nearly gone now, the unusually warm weather melting a good portion of the ice. Deciding not to take any chances, Ruby clipped her scythe to her belt and lowered herself back down the wall, clutching the new handholds she had made. Once she had climbed a safe distance, she leapt off of the wall, dissipating the force of the impact as she landed in a crouch and rolled forward. Dusting the flecks of ice off of her t-shirt, she entered Maya's house again, stowing the scythe in the safe and getting a drink of water. As she washed the glass and replaced it, Ruby realized that she was really pushing her time limits at this point. She quickly flew out of the front door, locking it behind her as she went, and ran all the way back to the Grey Wolf. She barely made it in time, Rowan's worried face scanning the window as she came into view. The fox's face quickly turned into a smile as he waved at her. Ruby grinned back, straightening her hair and clothes before entering the restaurant. What were you doing? The fox faunus asked, going back to setting the tables. Did you eat yet? I'm fine, Ruby said, ignoring the growling of her stomach. I was just taking a walk. She sniffed the air, the smell of spices and roasted meats reaching her nose. Do you think Mingan will let me eat if I finish doing my job? Rowan shrugged. You can just go ask him, he's always in his office anyways. Is the food free? Rowan nodded. Yeah, you can get some leftovers from the kitchen. Mingan is really nice about this stuff. Awesome, Ruby said, giving herself a little fist pump as she walked into the kitchen. The rest of the staff were sitting around at the empty tables, chatting with empty plates of food in front of themselves. A few of them got up to put the dishes into the dishwasher, cleaning their hands before sitting back down. Ruby didn't mind, quickly scrubbing and rinsing the extra dishes as she worked, eager to get to her lunch. After neatly stacking the dishes, Ruby took a leftover slice of steak, put it down on a plate, and grabbed a fork and knife. There weren't any customers at the moment, so Ruby supposed that it would be okay if she ate. Not to mention all the other employees who were sitting around and talking. She sat down at one of the empty tables to eat. Rowan came over a few minutes later, untying his apron as he sat down next to her. Ruby swallowed a mouthful. So, did you eat yet? Ruby asked. Rowan nodded. I ate a bit before you got back, he said. They sat in silence for a while, Rowan waiting for Ruby to finish eating before he began speaking. A single customer came in while she ate, a few of the staff getting up to prepare him some food. Do you want to know how I got into this situation? Rowan asked quietly. Ruby looked around, making sure that they were far enough from the other staff so that they wouldn't be heard. Sure, Ruby said. I was curious about that anyways. Rowan hesitated. Well, it's not really much of a story. That's okay, Ruby assured him. Who knows, maybe you'll give me something to work with. And besides, we're friends, right? You can talk to me about whatever you want. Well, alright. To start off from the beginning, my parents don't really know what this town is like. They've been in the small Fox community this entire time. I don't think they've even come to the main city since we moved here. They think that this entire settlement is nice and safe, and that it would be perfectly fine for me to go into this town and find a job by myself. I'm not even sure if they know that carnivores are supposed to dislike the plant eaters now. Wow. Why don't you just tell them what it's like? I wanted to, and I still want to. But by the time I realized how lawless this place really was, it was way too late. So what happened? Rowan sighed. Cedric happened. He was really nice and all at first, but I think he was just tricking me. And then he asked me to help him rob people, and I refused. Good for you, Ruby exclaimed. Robbing people is bad. Rowan looked as if he were about to cry. But I'm robbing people right now. He blackmailed me, remember? Ruby paused. Well then, it's not your fault. Because he's making you do it. I guess so, Rowan said dejectedly. So that's my story. Ruby glanced at Cedric, who was sitting at one of the tables and talking to someone else. What if I went up to him right now and gave him a few stabs? What? Ruby pantomimed holding a knife and jabbing it forward. You know, just walking up to him and giving him a few good stabs. That'll show him. Rowan looked doubtful. But then they'll see you, and you'll get into trouble. Maybe I could stab everyone. Ruby suggested. I don't think that's going to work. You don't even have a knife right now. Then I'll use my hands, Ruby decided. A quick snap of the neck and no one will suspect a thing. Rowan looked nervous, glancing around as his fox ears twitched. I think you should calm down before you get yourself arrested. So is that a no? Ruby asked. I mean, you have to be decisive. After all, we're talking about killing someone. Rowan stuttered. I think I'm going to have to think about this for a while. Sure, Ruby said, absent-mindedly kicking her legs. So, what do we do now? Rowan took a moment to respond. We just wait and serve any customers that come in, he said. It gets pretty boring during this time. He looked at her. Who is that rabbit faunus from last night? She's my friend. Like I said before, she's the one I moved in with after I decided to stop being a loner. Her name's Maya, she's a police officer. Rowan looked around for a second before speaking, his voice hushed. What are you two trying to do? Huh? Why were you two on the rooftops last night? I know you guys said you would help me, but what's your goal? I'm not supposed to tell you, sorry. But in general, we want to do something about this whole mess between the carnivores and the herbivores. Rowan's eyes widened. Does it have something to do with the attacks on the herbivore faunus communities? Ruby kept her mouth shut, avoiding Rowan's questioning gaze. Rowan frowned. I'm not deaf, you know, he said, indicating the fox ears in his head. I've heard Cedric talking about something like that, and I've also heard rumors about this sort of thing. Ruby got up, smiling apologetically at Rowan. Oh look, I think they're done eating. Gotta go do the dishes, bye. Ignoring Rowan's protests, Ruby quickly walked into the kitchen, scanning the room for things to clean. When she was done with the dishes, she went back outside and sat next to Rowan again. This time the fox faunus avoided mentioning the incidents between the carnivores and the herbivores, instead just shooting down Ruby's plans of getting rid of Cedric and suggesting his own. The afternoon passed slowly, the occasional customer breaking the monotony while Ruby talked with Rowan. Cedric was always with someone whenever Ruby looked over at him. When the customers came in for dinner, the weasel always made sure to stand near someone else or otherwise stay out of her reach. After the dinner rush was over, Ruby hurriedly untied her apron and walked to the door, eager to meet up with Maya. See you, Rowan, Ruby called. Rowan was also untying his apron, getting ready to leave. Bye, Rose. See you tomorrow. Yup, Ruby responded as she pushed the door open and walked outside. A gust of cold air immediately hit her, the weather getting chilly again. Ruby ignored the biting wind as she looked around, taking a few seconds to find and recognize Maya. The rabbit faunus was wearing a thick hood, her ears hidden under it as she huddled against the wall. A scarf adorned her neck, the thick material squeezed into the hood. You're really not cold, huh? Maya muttered, seeing Ruby's t-shirt. No, Ruby said, giving Maya a hug. Maya waited a few seconds before freeing herself from the embrace. She picked a direction and began to walk. First we'll go to the laundromats, because you need to be able to do your own laundry. Then we're going to get you some more clothes. Ruby looked pensive. I get my paycheck on Friday. Can we wait until then or something? Maya raised an eyebrow. Do you want to wear the t-shirt for a week? Well, no way, Maya stated, grabbing Ruby's arm and tugging her forward. You are not wearing the same outfit for 5 days. What would your coworkers think of you? Ruby smiled as she let Maya drag her along. Okay. Nothing too fancy, though. I just need a few changes of shirts and pants. Of course, Maya said. This is my money you're spending after all. The laundromat was in the middle of the city, the stone and brick ceiling advertising its services with a large sign on the front. A few dust-powered lights illuminated the sign, the sun setting as the night took over. The glass front provided a view of washers and dryers lining the inside of the shop, quite a few of the machines in less than stellar condition. People were sitting on the chairs provided inside, reading a book or checking their tablets as they waited. Maya kept her hands in her pockets as she talked. I don't think I need to tell you, but avoid the broken-looking machines. They suck at cleaning and sometimes they just eat your lean. Also, you should stay with your clothes and bring something to do. Don't leave your clothes unattended. Ruby nodded. Should I bring laundry detergent or something? Maya shook her head. You can buy it at the laundromat. Any other questions? I'm good. Then we're going to go get some clothes for you. Any colors you prefer? Actually, let's just get more neutral colored shirts. You'll want to look tidy, but you shouldn't stand out. Maya glanced at Ruby. You're not going to keep your shirts clean, or you? Ruby averted her gaze. Well, you know, blood comes out easily. I mean, it's really hard to avoid getting them dirty with the whole thing with Emmett, plus people attacking me. Right, okay. Cheap t-shirts and jeans it is, Maya decided, striding forward. In stark contrast to the laundromat, the clothing store Maya took her to was in the outskirts of town, the plain brick building surrounded with a few unoccupied structures. A simple sign on the front advertised cheap clothing, the empty window frames giving a glimpse into the shop. What's with all the empty buildings? Ruby asked. Maya looked around. Would you want to live here? By yourself, alone, isolated? Maybe. Maya thought for a moment before grinning a bit. Okay, so I guess that describes where we live. But most people want to live with others, in their own communities. These buildings probably won't be used until the population in this settlement increases. The door was made out of plywood, the hinges squeaking a little as Maya pushed it open. The thin deer faunus at the desk looked at them, squinting suspiciously at Ruby and sniffing the air. He cleared his throat. No Karn. Ah, shut up already, Maya interrupted, ignoring his protests as she walked into the warehouse. Ruby giggled as she followed Maya. I can see why they like you, she whispered. Maya shrugged. I can't help but get annoyed when I see people like them, whether they're carnivores or herbivores. You just came in to buy clothes, it's not like you're torturing his family or anything. Right. And he still tried to stop you from buying clothes. It's people like them who keep this conflict going. If the civilian population just cooled their heads and thought things through, we could easily identify the troublemakers on both sides of the issue. The store was mostly empty, the only other customer in the store a mouse faunus that was browsing through the shoes. Maya and Ruby walked down the racks of the clothing, Maya periodically pulling off a dull-colored shirt or two. Ruby chose a few pairs of jeans and a few pairs of sweatpants, making sure to only pick ones that weren't brightly colored and were ordinary looking. She also chose a few sets of underclothes, picking sensible tops and shorts. They finished quickly, the two of them meeting back up before bringing the bundles in their arms to the checkout. The deer faunus glared at them the whole time, grumpily counting their clothes and demanding the lien. Maya pulled out her wallet and dropped the plastic cards onto the counter before grabbing two large paper shopping bags and scooping the clothes into it. They each held a bag as they walked out the door. The sky was completely dark now, the streetlights illuminating the sidewalk as they began to walk home. Ruby felt something hit her eyelashes, making her blink. It's snowing again, Ruby said, tilting her head back and trying to catch the snowflakes in her mouth. Maya clutched her clothes even tighter around herself, staring at the snow with a vengeance. Great. Decent weather for a few days and then this shit again. Ruby looked at her. Don't we still have a month or so of winter left? Don't remind me. The two of them began to walk quickly, their pace nearly a jog. So, no bar tonight? Maya shook her head. Not in this weather. I'd rather stay home and stay warm. What about Emmett? He'll understand. He knows I hate the cold. By the time they reached Maya's house, a layer of white powder had already built up on the ground, a gust of wind making the rabbit faunus shiver. Maya grimaced as she tried to warm her cold fingers, puffing warm breaths into them before reaching for the key in her pants pocket. Ruby set her bag on the ground. Here, let me do this. Thanks, Maya said, stuffing her hands back into her pockets. Ruby pulled out the keys and unlocked the door, beckoning Maya to go in first. She picked up the bags and stepped into the house, shutting the door behind her. Maya had already turned on the lights, a soft glow spreading throughout the room as the lantern came to life. The rabbit faunus pushed a bit of snow off of the counter and closed the kitchen window shutter. Did you eat yet? Ruby asked as she began heading for her room. Yup, Maya responded, surprising her. I didn't want the meat in the basement to go to waste, so I ate at the restaurant and I was going to have you cook at home. Are you okay with that? That's perfect, Ruby assured her. Now you won't have to go out in this weather, and I can save money. Good. I'm going to make some tea. You should put the clothes in your room and get some food for yourself. By the time Ruby was done sorting out the clothes, folding and placing them into the drawers, Maya was already boiling water, the stove fiery and hot. Ruby went down the basement stairs and slid open the cooler box. She chose a large random chunk of meat, checked to see if the ice in the box was still solid, then closed it. Maya. Do we have any spices or anything? Maya was dumping tea leaves into the kettle. Yeah, they're in the cabinet right above you. I think I have some random stuff, it's probably pretty dusty. The salt should be fine, though. Ruby grabbed a pan, setting down the frozen chunk of steak and beginning to heat it. Maya watched her with interest for a few minutes, but eventually grabbed her tea and sat down on the couch. As Ruby cooked, Maya kicked off her shoes and stretched out on the couch, holding the steaming mug between her fingers. Maya made a face as the smell of cooking flesh permeated the room. She massaged her ears as she took another sip of tea. Doesn't that remind you of human flesh? I bet human flesh would smell exactly the same. I can't imagine how you people eat that on a regular basis. Well, actually, human flesh. Ruby stopped herself, realizing she was in dangerous territory. Trying to get away from the topic, she hastily amended, I mean, it's not like I would know how it tastes or anything. But, this tastes good. And it's filling and yummy and tastes completely different from vegetables. Your choice, Maya said as she got up from the couch. She took a few cords of wood and dropped them into the stove, heating up the room a little more. When the steak was done, Ruby sprinkled a bit of salt on both sides before taking it out of the pan. She had already grabbed the meat with one hand and taken a bite when she realized that Maya was watching her. Ruby hastily set the steak down, looking for somewhere to wipe her hand. Oops. Maya sighed. You're not alone in the wilderness anymore, Red. She wiped Ruby's hands down with a hand towel before giving her a fork and a knife. Remember your manners. As Ruby finished up her food, Maya was sitting on the couch and reading through her tablet. Ruby washed the dishes in the sink, neatly placing them on the countertop to dry. Any news? No, Maya said. Investigation is still ongoing. She yawned, stretching and loosening her ponytail. Ruby looked at her thoughtfully, wondering how she could find a way to cuddle up with Maya. She sat down on the cough, edging closer to the rabbit faunus. So, what are you looking at? Maya glanced at her but didn't move. Just the police reports. Ruby said, scooting even closer. They were basically touching now, Ruby shoulder to shoulder with Maya. Oh, alright, Maya said, exasperated but smiling. Maya grabbed the blanket off of the edge of the couch, setting it down on the two of them as they sat next to each other. Ruby leaned against the rabbit, careful not to touch her despite what her instincts were screaming at her to do. Maya rolled her eyes. Keep your hands to yourself, Red. You get to sit with me because we're friends. Ruby grinned, putting her head against Maya's shoulder. Maya propped her tablet up between them and began to show Ruby the police database and the case information she was looking at. Ruby tried to focus on her words, but Maya's face and her brilliant blue hair was a little distracting. And then Maya's ears twitched, her body tensing up. What's wrong? Ruby asked, worried that she had startled her. Maya leapt up and flipped off of the couch, dashing to the table. I heard motorcycles, Maya whispered. I don't know what the hell is going on, but normal civilians wouldn't have access to motorcycles and wouldn't be driving around at this time, especially not to hear. Maya picked up her gun, cocked it, then threw an extendable police baton to Ruby. Swing it out to extend it. It's about 2 feet long. The weapon made a satisfying click as Ruby swung it outwards, the segments locking into place as it fully extended. Maya cleared the desk of papers and flipped it over, peeking over the top of the makeshift barrier. Ruby crept toward the entrance, raising her baton. With a loud cracking sound, the door and the kitchen shutters exploded inwards in a hail of wooden fragments. Chapter 53, Hired Guns. A roaring bear faunus burst through the door, his snarling face appearing through the cloud of wood fragments. Maya calmly raised her pistol and fired twice, both bullets exiting through the side of his head. The bear's face went slack, his body immediately going limp and dropping to the floor. At the same time, some sort of cat faunus broke through the kitchen window, her large black and white strip ears pressed against her head. She landed in a crouch on the floor, shaking her head free of wood splinters as she gazed about the room. Thick flakes of snow swirled in through the broken shutters. Ruby hesitated for a slight moment, surprised at her opponent's method of entry, then threw her baton at the intruder. The spinning mass of metal caught the cat faunus on the forehead, making her let out a surprised yowl. That's not how you're supposed to use a baton, Rose. Maya shouted, ducking under the table as bullets came whizzing through the front entrance. Ruby ignored the rabbit, her heart pounding as she leapt at the stunned cat. The cat recovered just as Ruby vaulted over the kitchen counter, ducking under Ruby's first swing as she put a hand to her belt. The faunus hands were a blur as she took out several thin blades, twirling them between her fingers. Ruby swung her knee upwards, hoping to catch the cat in the head, but the cat was already gone, perched on top of the counter, her yellow eyes wide as she stared at Ruby. Ruby ignored the odd sensation in her stomach as she dived forward once again, her arms outstretched as she reached for the cat. While Maya was busy with the firefight, Ruby ran after the cat Faunus, knocking over plates and smashing through cabinets as she swung at her agile opponent. The Faunus continued dodging, staying out of Ruby's reach as Ruby cracked the stone countertops with each swing, her fists pounding into the stone and sending shards flying. Ruby reinforced her fingers with more aura to lessen the damage done to her fingers as she tried to catch the Faunus. With a growl, Ruby disappeared in a burst of rose petals, making the cat Faunus blink in surprise. Ruby was behind her in an instant, and quickly locked her fingers around her opponent's neck. The cat Faunus muscles immediately went taut, her hands scrabbling at Ruby's fingers as she tried to free herself. Ruby grinned, revealing her teeth as she bent down to rip out her throat. Ruby's left arm went limp. Her grip loosened and her arm fell to her side as the cat Faunus freed herself from Ruby's other hand. The cat's neck was splotchy red and her throat was making an odd rattling sound as she staggered away, coughing. Ruby stared at the kitchen knife lying lengthwise in her upper arm, a trickle of blood coming out of the wound. The cut was shallow, her aura having stopped the knife before it could go deeper, but it had obviously still hit something important. The cat Faunus had backed up to the shutter again, still gasping and coughing as she climbed up the counter. Seeing that her prey was about to escape, Ruby slid the knife out of her arm and threw it at the cat Faunus, catching her in the back as she tumbled out of the window frame. Just before the cat Faunus disappeared from Ruby's view, a pair of muscular arms caught her and gently lowered her to the ground. A dog Faunus stuck his head through the window, his teeth bared and his eyes wide with fury. He had sharp triangular ears, his hair a blend of orange and black, and his umber-colored eyes were gleaming in the night. Despite the cold, he only wore a leather vest and dark blue jeans, steam rising into the air as he glared at her. His arm muscles bulging, he flung himself through the window, taking Ruby by surprise as he tackled her. Ruby threw out her right fist, catching his left arm, but his right fist slammed into her chin, making her see stars as she flew back across the counter, hitting the side of the couch and bouncing to the ground. Rose. Maya screamed, pointing the gun at the dog and firing. Clearly possessing quicker reflexes than the bear Faunus, the dog had already ducked behind the counter, the bullets glancing harmlessly of the stone surface. Taking advantage of the distraction, a lynx stepped into the room, her face in a rictus of anger as she fired at the thick desk Maya was hiding behind. She held a black handgun in each hand, forcing Maya to stay behind cover as she laid down a hail of bullets. "You killed him, you bitch," the lynx shouted. A glimmer of tears showed on her face as she ran out of bullets in both guns. She deftly handled the weapons, dropping the magazines from each and slipping fresh ones into each gun at the same time, taking only a moment to spare a glance for her fallen partner. The bear Faunus slumped on the floor in a growing puddle of blood. The solid wooden desk flew upwards, catching the lynx unawares and making her scream with pain as her forearms shattered, the desk pinning her to the ground as her handguns flew out of her grip. She writhed in pain beneath the desk, her broken arms making her unable to push the heavy weight off of her. Maya looked towards Ruby, glimpsing the dog Faunus jumping across the counter and at Ruby. She quickly fired the remaining 3 bullets in her magazine, swearing as they barely nicked her quickly moving target. Cursing her lack of ammo, she began to run toward Ruby but suddenly stopped, her ears twitching. The rabid Faunus immediately dropped to the ground, flattening her ears as a sleek motorcycle flew through the front door and skimmed her ponytail as it roared past her. The motorcycle slammed into the wall and sent a cloud of dust flying up, its twisted metal scattering across the floor as it broke into pieces. Ruby was trying to fend off the dog as they rolled around on the ground. Her head was still ringing as she wildly punched with her good arm, though her aura has protected her from the brunt of the blow. Her left arm was beginning to heal already, the muscle fibers trying to twist back together. The dog was slamming fists into her body, trying to break through her aura before she could recover. Ruby managed to get her good arm around his neck for a second, squeezing, but the dog Faunus instantly reacted, grabbing her wrist and throwing her across the room and into the wall. Ruby took the brief respite to find her footing, glaring at the Faunus that was running toward her. A man stepped through the door, ignoring the crying of the lynx beneath the table as he unsheathed his swords. The wolf Faunus wore a white dress shirt and black dress pants, his brown tufted ears clearly visible through his hair. His feral yellow eyes glanced around the room, focusing on Maya as a target. Maya took a moment to analyze the situation, looking at the empty gun in her hand. She then whipped it at the Faunus' face, throwing the pistol with all of her strength. The wolf Faunus let out a low laugh, deflecting the pistol to the ground. But Maya had already accomplished her goal, using the distraction to dive and pick up the two handguns the lynx had dropped, rolling and bringing them up to point them at her opponent. The wolf Faunus howled at her, realizing his disadvantage and immediately charging her head on. Maya paused in surprise as the ammo clips dropped out of the guns. The lynx had been hit with the table midway through reloading and she hadn't been able to lock the clips in place. Then the wolf was upon her, swinging his blades, forcing Maya to use the guns to parry his sword blows. Meanwhile, Ruby was wrestling with the dog again, a sharp discomfort spiking through her stomach when she was thrown face down onto the floor. She rolled right side up and kicked out with both legs, knocking the dog away and cracking his ribs from the force of the blows. Ruby took the chance to look down at her stomach. Her t-shirt had 3 red bloodstains, each spreading from a hole in her shirt. A piece of metal protruded from one of the holes, the tiny blade sliding out easily as Ruby quickly pulled it free. Saliva flecked with blood was dripping from the dog's mouth, Ruby's traded blows having done significant damage to him. Despite the fact that he hadn't been able to take down her aura, he charged Ruby again, his legs pumping as he closed the gap between them. The moment the dog was in range, Ruby brought up the blade and shoved it through the underside of his jaw. His growls quickly turned to panicked whines as he realized what had happened, his arms flailing uselessly against Ruby as she ignored his punches and held onto his shoulder. With a savage grin, she pulled the knife out and speared it through his eye, careful not to damage his brain and end her fun prematurely. His whines now turned into screaming. Vitreous fluid leaked from his punctured and deflated eye, the jelly-like substance dripping down his face and smearing Ruby's hand. Ruby pulled out the knife and began to work on his other eye, slicing it open. The dog Faunus tried to bite her desperation, his mouth gnashing in fear and pain. She shoved the knife into his mouth, cleaving his tongue in two as the dog retched, the taste of his own fluids making him vomit. Maya was losing her footing, the wolf Faunus pushing her back bit by bit in a whirlwind of steel. A few shallow cuts appeared on her arms, her aura able to stop most of the attacks but not entirely nullify them. Realizing she couldn't keep this up forever, Maya decided to make a move. The rabbit Faunus pretended to take a step back, shifting her stance, then kicked up one of the loaded magazines from the ground. The wolf instinctively swiped it out of the air, unwilling to let Maya get her hands on the ammo. The next magazine flew up too, and he also flung that to the side. The 2 handguns were then thrown at his face, forcing him to bring his swords up to stop the chunks of metal from breaking his jaw. And then Maya was right next to him, grabbing his sword blades with her bare hands and grimacing. Aura flared around her hands, stopping the swords after they had penetrated only a few millimeters into her skin. The 2 were locked in a struggle for a few seconds, spittle flying from the wolf Faunus' mouth as he panted. His expression turned panicked as the sword slowly began moving towards his body. Sweat beaded on his forehead and his arms trembled as Maya pushed down, driving the swords back into his arms. Blood bloomed on his shirt as the sword bit into him, his grip weakening as his wrists twisted. "I give up," the wolf shouted, his voice hoarse with terror. "Drop the swords," Maya ordered. The wolf gulped, letting go of the weapons and immediately stumbling back. Maya flipped a sword around, still holding the blade as she slammed the hilt into his head, dropping him to the floor. Maya leaned the swords against the upturned table, wiping her bloody palms in her pants and turning to watch Ruby. The blood-stained girl was preparing to finish the wolf Faunus off. The Faunus was trying to crawl away on all fours as she stood over him, grabbing his hair and pulling his head back. Multiple puncture wounds decorated his face and his clothing was filled with numerous tears. She corrected herself, "Rose, it's over. You don't need to kill him." Ruby turned at the sound of her voice, her expression showing no signs of recognition as she stared at the brilliant blue hair. The dog Faunus slumped to the floor as she let go of him, pulling her tiny knife out of his side. She clutched the metal blade in her hand as she stalked towards Maya, her slow pace sending shivers up the rabbit fauna's spine as Ruby drew closer. Maya grabbed a sword off of the table, holding it out in front of her. "Rose, snap out of it." Ruby kept walking forward, her expression hungry. Maya's hands trembled ever so slightly as Ruby continued her pace, her arms and legs moving mechanically as she ignored the blade and stretched her hand out toward the rabbit. Maya panicked and thrust the sword forward, the tip of the blade parting her shirt. A new spot of blood bloomed between her breasts, the cold steel sinking into her flesh as the metal worked its way into her sternum. And then Ruby sucked in a breath, the simple blade falling out of her hand as she took a step back. Maya jerked in surprise, barely stopping herself from running the girl through. Ruby took a moment to find her voice, rubbing a hand over her chest and trying to wipe the blood away. "I'm okay, Maya." Her own internal turmoil contradicted her words, her damaged and aura-starved body clamoring for blood as her reason tried to suppress the hunger. "I'm okay." Maya lowered the sword back down to her side. "You sure? I've seen people in bloodlust before, and it wasn't pretty." She indicated the chair that was previously at the desk and somehow miraculously still standing. "Why don't you sit down for a moment while I sort all of this out?" Ruby blinked, trying to restore order to her mind as she rubbed her sticky palms in her shirt. "Yeah, that would be good." She watched as Maya rummaged through her bag, bringing out a set of handcuffs and securing the wolf on the floor. The rabbit dragged him over to Ruby. "Keep an eye on him. If he wakes up, just hold him down and try not to kill him." The lynx was unconscious under the table, the white tips of her broken bones protruding from her skin. Her breaths were shallow, the wooden structure slowly smothering her. Maya carefully lifted the table off of her body, making sure not to injure her further. "Rose, can you grab me a towel from the closet?" Ruby nodded, running down the hallway and grabbing a towel. As she walked back to Maya, the rabbit faunus had taken 2 sticks from the tinder pile, breaking off pieces to shorten them. Maya took the towels from Ruby's hands. "Thanks." She pulled the unconscious fauna's bones back into place, then used the makeshift bandages and the splint to support and immobilize her arm. Then she took out another pair of handcuffs from her bag and shackled the lynx's wrists together. Ruby was impressed. "How many of those do you have?" "A lot," Maya assured her. "I come prepared. Besides, they can also be used as makeshift weapons." The next person she attended to was the dog. The pitiful faunus was curled up on the floor, his eyelids a mangled mess as he wept bloody tears. "Did you really have to stab him in the eyes?" Maya asked as she handcuffed the unresisting dog faunus and bound a bandage around his eyes. Ruby shrugged. "Well, he was trying to bite me, and I found a knife in my stomach, so." "Right," Maya said, sticking her head out of the window. "Give me a second." She vaulted the windowsill, landing on her feet and running toward the motorcycles outside. Ruby got out of her chair and walked over to the window, watching as Maya dragged the cat faunus out of the snowstorm and back toward the house. A trail of blood marked her desperate struggle to the motorcycle, her legs mostly paralyzed as she feebly struggled in Maya's grasp. Ruby sat back down in her chair as Maya pulled the cat faunus in through the front door, the kitchen knife still protruding from her back. Her skin was deathly pale from the blood loss and the freezing temperatures, her eyes a little unfocused as she shivered. Upon seeing the dog faunus, she wailed, fresh tears pouring from her eyes as she saw him lying in fetal position, the white strip of cloth wrapped around his head. Maya handcuffed her as she grew limp, weeping in horror. "Let me see him," she mumbled numbly, pointing toward the dog faunus. Maya opened her mouth to deny her request, but stopped herself, taking a moment to observe the situation before carrying her and setting her down next to the dog. The cat faunus stroked his ears, murmuring soothing words between her own choking sobs. The dog immediately turned around and wrapped his arms around her, the two clutching each other soundlessly. Maya sighed. "Well, that's an odd pairing if I've ever seen one." Ruby agreed, noticing that the wolf faunus was slowly waking up. He sat up and looked around the room, taking in the casualties. "This was supposed to be easy," he said unsteadily, staring at his own hands as he leaned back against the wall. "What have I done?" He looked up at Ruby. "What have you done?" His despairing look made her uncomfortable. She turned away from his searching eyes, trying to seek solstice in Maya. Maya, on the other hand, returned his gaze, her expression cold and unyielding. Didn't you come to kill us? The wolf faunus broke his gaze, looking down and giving her the tiniest of nods. Then be thankful that you're still alive. With that, she ended the conversation, beginning her search for the tablet. She found it wedged between couch cushions, the corner a little dented. Swiping it open, she dialed the number for the police. A voice crackled through the speakers. You again, Maya. What happened this time? Attempted burglary at my residence. Requesting permission to your house. The voice asked in disbelief. Don't you live in the police housing district? Maya looked annoyed. Yes. 5 attackers. 1 is dead, the rest are in stable condition. I'm requesting permission to hold them here for a little while. I'm going to ask them some questions and then I'll have you pick them up. You're going to extract your own brand of justice, huh? The voice asked smugly. Maya sighed. No, I just want some information. Of course, the voice said mirthfully. But even if you didn't say anything, we wouldn't have been able to send a vehicle. The snowstorm is lowering visibility and the roads are too slippery and narrow. So don't worry, we'll take in whatever's left of them when you're done. I'll even forget the fact that you told me how many were alive. Thanks, Maya said sarcastically. Anything for you, baby. Maya swiped the tablet shut, turning to face the prisoners. The wolf faunus was staring at her, his face set stubborn expression. You'll never get anything out of me, he declared. Maya grabbed his shirt collar, pulling him up as he yelped with pain and glaring into his eyes. You're only making this harder for yourself. Ruby stared, interested. Now this is something I can get behind. Can I help? Ruby asked. Maya dropped the wolf on the ground, considering her proposal. Let's get them secured, and then we'll talk. Okay, Ruby said. I still have tons of steel silk. Do you need to use any? Maya nodded. That would be perfect. She looked down the hallway. I feel silly for asking this, but do you mind if we put the badly injured ones in your bedroom? Ruby was nearly bouncing with joy. Not at all, she said cheerfully, realizing that this would force her to sleep somewhere else. Maya cracked a smile. Of course not, she said. Ruby went to the basement to get her steel silk as Maya brought out 2-leg shackles, placing them on the lynx and the wolf. When Ruby came back, they bound the struggling wolf to the chair with steel silk, wrapping it around him multiple times and tying the strips off with secure knots. The two worked together and dragged him down the hallway, stopping at the closet. Oh hell no, the wolf said as Maya began taking out the towels and bedsheets. I'm not going in there. You don't have a choice, Maya said, stacking the towels and bedsheets in her arms. The wolf let out a stream of profanities as Ruby grinned and stuffed him into the closet, closing the door on his face. At least we'll be able to feed them with the meat you brought here, Maya said as she walked back to the other 3. Ruby nodded. Yeah. She coughed violently, specks of blood spraying the wall before she covered her mouth with her hand. Maya rushed over to her, grabbing her shoulders. Rose. Ruby held up a hand, indicating for her to wait a second. A few tense moments later, Ruby coughed again, making a face as she spat a small knife into her hand. Oh, so that's where it went, Ruby contemplated as she wiped her mouth with her ragged shirt. Maya stepped back, blinking. Has this happened before? Should I be worried? Ruby opened her mouth, then closed it, shrugging. The two of them carefully picked the groggy lynx, Ruby holding her under the arms and Maya grabbing her bound legs as they wrapped her legs with steel silk and tied her upper arms to her torso. The lynx was slowly waking up, wincing whenever her arms were jostled. Where do you think she should go? Maya asked. Go fuck yourselves, the lynx faunus mumbled, looking away from them. Bathroom, Ruby suggested. Maya shook her head. Too inconvenient. Ruby pointed down the hallway. Then maybe we can just put her with the wolf for now. It's not like they're going anywhere, anyways. Maya nodded. That could work. The lynx had gone silent again as they carried her toward the closet. Maya unlocked the door and opened it, the wolf faunus greeting them with a few choice words. Ignoring him, the two propped the lynx up against the wall. Try to escape and you'll regret it, Maya threatened her. The lynx refused to look at them, turning to stare at the wall and whispering quietly to herself. Maya was about to shut the door when the wolf Faunus interrupted them. I need to use the bathroom, he pleaded. Nice try, Ruby grinned. I think I know where this is going. You're going to try to escape, aren't you? The wolf growled at her. No, I actually need to. You'll go when I say you can, Maya decided. Hold it in for now. She shut the door and led Ruby back down the hallway, invectives coming out of the closet as they walked away. Ruby looked at Maya. Ah, we're going to let him pee sometime, right? Maya chuckled grimly. Of course. But first we need to deal with our other two prisoners. The two were still locked in their embrace, the cat Faunus apparently asleep from exhaustion. The dog's ears twitched as they walked towards the pair, the Faunus turning his head toward them and letting out a low growl. Easy there, Maya soothed him. I need to get the knife out of her back, all right. The dog clutched the cat even tighter. Maya sighed. Rose, grab his arms. The dog Faunus immediately lashed out upon hearing her. But he was weakened and traumatized, so Ruby just grabbed his fist and pried his other arm off of the cat. The cat had woken up now and was struggling to stand up, but her legs kept failing her. Leave him alone, she cried as Ruby dragged the dog away. Ruby had one hand around his neck and one hand holding his arms together, keeping him away from her as he thrashed. Maya propped the cat Faunus up, unraveling a spool of steel silk. Brace yourself, she warned, then pulled the knife out. The cat spasmed, letting out a tiny mewl as Maya tightly bound the wound and stopped the blood flow. The rabbit Faunus nodded to Ruby, so she dropped the dog Faunus to the floor and stepped back. The cat found him again, the dog immediately hugging her and refusing to let go. The two just watched them. Well, this is awkward, Maya commented. Cat, if you want to live, get the dog to carry you to your new rooms. The cat Faunus looked at them in fear before tilting her head and whispering into the dog's ear. It took a few seconds, but he eventually nodded, slowly standing up and cradling the cat. Ruby and Maya guided him along as they made their way to the guest bedroom, the dog cautiously shuffling forward and stumbling whenever he glanced off of a wall. Maya sat the dog down on the bed, glancing at the windows contemplatively. Pulling out set of handcuffs, she grabbed the cat's wrist and cuffed her to the metal bed frame before she could react. The cat flinched but didn't complain, instead just holding the dog for comfort as Maya handcuffed the other Faunus to the bed. Maya pointed toward the shutters. If two want to escape, go ahead, but there's a snowstorm outside and I don't think you'll be able to do much in your condition. The cat Faunus nodded, then burrowed her head into the dog's chest. The dog Faunus frustratedly pulled at the handcuffs, growling, then gave up and sat back against the bed, nursing his ribs. Maya closed the door and walked into the living room, sitting down on the couch. She didn't protest as Ruby sat next to her, leaning on her shoulder as they finally relaxed a little. Maya ran a hand through her hair. Well, that was unexpected. Chapter 54, Interrogation. By the time things had calmed down, hours had passed. It was quite late, and the blizzard was still raging on, the storm showing no signs of abating. Did you do something? Maya shook her head. No. I don't know why they attacked me, unless... She narrowed her eyes, sitting up. Unless someone squealed. Rowan. I don't see how it could have been anyone else. At this point the police think of me as one of them, and I don't think any of them would try to hire people to kill me. The only thing I can think of is if the hunting carnivores somehow caught wind of what I was doing, but I've definitely been very careful. Ruby looked conflicted. So, do you want me to get rid of Rowan? Maya raised an eyebrow. Didn't we talk about this? I don't think it's right to have you as my personal assassin. But won't he mess up our whole plan if he talks? Maya shook her head. No, or well, at least not anymore. The only thing he could have said about us is that he saw us on the roof, and that we talked about trying to fix the problem between herbivores and carnivores. Right. Ruby nodded. Yup, that's how I remember it. Good. So what we do now is be more careful, Maya shuddered, and patch up the shutter and front door so I don't freeze to death. Ruby grabbed the blanket off of the couch and wrapped it around Maya before standing up, smiling. What do you want me to do? Maya sighed contentedly. Thanks, Rose. Hey, do you mind if I just call you Rose for now? She tilted her chin toward the walls. You never know who's listening. Not a problem at all. Great. Maya closed her eyes, leaning back again. There might be some saws in the basement, but I haven't checked since I moved in. Just try to find a way to get some wood and patch up these holes. You can dismantle some furniture to get the nails. I'm going to go take a nap. Ruby watched as Maya's head titled upward, her mouth parting slightly as she fell asleep. She pushed the indecent thoughts out of her head as she headed for the basement, an idea forming in her mind. Ruby selected a few thicker logs of wood, then took her scythe out of the safe. Moving some canisters of dust and a few stacks of wood to the side, she cleared some working space and sat down on the floor. The scythe slid open with a soft whir, hyperextending so that its blade was nearly vertical with the shaft. Holding the log with one hand and grabbing the head of the scythe with her other, she brought the scythe down and neatly sliced the log in half. She repeated the process with the other logs, careful not to injure herself. A few minutes later, she had a large stack of planks and some useless chunks of wood. Refolding her scythe, she placed it back into the safe before heading back up the stairs. Ruby set the planks down in the living room and headed for the guest room. Two startled eyes greeted her from the darkness as she carefully opened the door. Sorry for disturbing you two. I just need to grab something. Neither of them made a sound as Ruby grabbed the large drawer. Their mouths dropped open a little as Ruby flared her aura and hefted the drawer in one arm and backed out of the entrance, shutting the door with her free arm. Seeing that Maya was still asleep on the couch, Ruby headed for Maya's bedroom. She quietly set the drawer on the floor and closed the door behind her. Her clothes were still in the drawers, so she pulled out the clothes and stacked them in Maya's bedroom closet, then placed her undergarments on top of Maya's dresser. The wood came apart with a snapping and popping noises as Ruby pulled the individual pieces of the drawer apart, making sure to pick up any dropped nails. The dismantled closet yielded a large handful of nails and the shattered wooden pieces were left in the corner in case Maya wanted to use them for firewood. Ruby decided to fix the shutters first. She grabbed the boards she had cut up, stacking them lengthwise over the shutter. She positioned the nails on the before using her palm to smash the iron into the wood. She worked quietly, the dull thuds of her hands and the soft groaning sounds from the wood the only things giving her away. After she was done with the shutters, she moved on to boarding up the door, nearly running out of wood before finishing. She dropped the nails onto the counter, washed her hands, and pulled out a kettle. After filling it with water and starting up the stove, she headed back to the couch, watching Maya sleep for a little while before waking her. I'm done, Ruby whispered, stroking Maya's shoulder. Maya yawned wearily, blinking in surprise as her eyes focused on Ruby. Are you boiling water? Ruby scratched her head. I thought you'd like some tea. Maya surprised her with a hug, wrapping her wiry arms around Ruby and pressing her into her chest. Ruby gave up on subtlety and blatantly smushed her face into Maya's breast. She hummed in delight. The rabbit faunus laughed. I can't believe you've only been here for a few days. I feel like I've known you for a lot longer than that. Ruby didn't respond, instead looking up and hoping for a kiss. Maya grinned. Don't push your luck, she said, getting up from the couch. Ah, Ruby whimpered in protest as Maya went to the kitchen. Ruby made an attempt to convince Maya to put less tea leaves into the kettle, but Maya refused, claiming that it wouldn't be real tea. After pouring the steaming liquid into mugs, Maya set the table back upright and looked around for the missing chair. Ah, damn it. We tied that wolf to the chair, didn't we? Yup. Couch it is, then. Ruby made another attempt to drink the tea, diluting it a few times by adding water before it was palatable. Ruby set the mug down on her lap. So what do we do about the prisoners? Maya took a gulp of tea before responding. What about them? Torture. Ruby asked uncertainly. Do we torture them? For, information, of course. Interrogation, Maya corrected her. I guess it's basically torture, but as a police officer it's a vital distinction. Right. So do we interrogate them? Of course, Maya said, taking another gulp of her tea. But nothing too extreme. I have a feeling that some of them are going to break without too much pressure. Ruby looked disappointed. So no stabby. Maya nearly choked on her tea. No, Rose, she coughed, laughing. No stabbing. But how will you get information from them? Interrogators have a lot of techniques they can use, but I think scaring the shit out of the wolf will be enough. She motioned with her hand. Finish your tea. We'll question him now, while he's still in shock. Ruby took a bigger swallow of her drink. The wolf is the leader, right? Maya nodded. I'm hoping that he knows more than his friends. The other three aren't really in any condition to talk right now, anyways. Ruby gagged a little as she messily drank the rest of the bitter tea, wiping her mouth after downing it. Do I get to do anything? Maya shrugged. If I can't get anything out of him, I'll let you try by yourself. Just follow my lead and play along for now. Maya stood up and walked over to the closet, waiting for Ruby to follow. In a sudden motion, she opened the door and grabbed the wolf's chair, dragging him out into the lit hallway. He blinked wearily, his exhausted eyes trying to focus on whatever was in front of him. Maya gave him a few seconds to recover his senses, then shouted at him and threw him down the basement stairs. Ruby heard frightened yelps as the wolf bumped down the stairs, unable to break his fall as he awkwardly tumbled down the wooden steps. Wow, Ruby whispered. What happened to just scaring him? Maya started down the stairs. He'll be fine. The wolf Faunus was lying dazed at the bottom of the steps. He grunted a bit as Maya kicked him a few times, closing his eyes and bracing himself when Maya set him upright. Talk, Maya ordered. I'd give you the whole spiel about your rights, but frankly, I don't give a shit. You're in the middle of nowhere and your life is in our hands. The wolf took a moment to understand her words, his face setting in a stubborn frown. I've already said that I'm not talking. Is throwing me down the stairs the best you can? Maya punched him in the face, sending the wolf and the chair sprawling to the ground before she picked them back up again. We're being gentle right now. Remember that we can do anything we want to you. His face was already swelling a bit as he spat blood onto the ground. You're not getting anything out of me. Even if I tell you what I know, I don't have any guarantees that I'll make it out of this alive. Maya sighed, cracking her knuckles. I'm sorry that you feel that way. She punched him in the stomach, making him retch. If you don't feel like talking, we can always get another prisoner. She broke a finger on his hand, making him howl in pain. Maybe your screams will make them cooperate. Wait, the wolf panted, cringing away from Maya's fist. I can tell you a few details. If you release me, I'll tell you everything else. Maya folded her arms. I don't bargain with criminals. She motioned Ruby forward. I don't need you anymore. Ruby took her cue, stepping forward with her teeth bared. In an instant she had grabbed his head and slammed him against the wall. Her teeth were at his throat before he could protest, the sharp tips sinking into his skin as she took her time, lapping up the blood. The wolf's eyes briefly met her unnaturally blue eyes before rolling back into his head in terror. He gurgled incoherently, trying to form words as he thrashed his head about. Maya tapped Ruby's shoulder, making her take one last lick before she reluctantly pulled back. Maya's eyebrows shot up as she saw the neat circular bite marks in his skin, but she otherwise made no indication of her surprise. Were you trying to say something? She asked, keeping her hand on Ruby's shoulder. Please, he gasped. I don't want to die. Then talk, Maya said impatiently. He took a shuddering breath. D. Donnig. The sheriff told me that you had to be taken care of. He hung his head, crying. I didn't tell you, alright. We'll see, Maya simply said. She grabbed his chair and hauled him back up the stairs. Ruby licked her teeth as she trailed Maya, the warm treat contrasting with the hunger and worry from what she had just done. Maya shoved him back into the closet, the wolf offering no resistance as the chair slid into place. The lynx seemed surprised to see him back, turning to glance at her captors before staring at the wall again. Maya refilled their cups of tea and brought them back to the couch. The tepid liquid tasted even more bitter now and Ruby could barely swallow her mouthful. Ruby set the cup down, nervously touching her fingertips together as she waited for Maya to speak. Well done, Rose, Maya said. Ruby looked up with a confused look on her face. Huh. Maya nodded. Well done. You scared the shit out of him, we got the information, and no one died. I'd say that's a job well done. Bet. Maya wrapped an arm around her, pulling her closer. You might have just saved my life, and you helped me find out who was behind it. Everything's working out, so stop worrying. Really? Well, alright, Ruby said, snuggling into Maya. Do you think they'll try again? This Donig person. Well, Donig is the sheriff. Ruby stared up at her. What? He's a bear faunus. He probably heard about what I was doing from someone, maybe Rowan, so he sent people after me. Why are you so calm? Maya shrugged. I'm betting that he's probably not going to try again after considering the fact that he sent 5 people and I just reported that I had subdued all of them. Plus, I have you here. I highly doubt they can send enough people to take us both down. Ruby blushed a little, basking in the praise. Besides, we can always move out whenever we need to, Maya pointed out. There are literally dozens of empty houses around here, so it'll take them a while to find our new living space if we're careful and lie low. I think we should just kill everyone, Ruby suggested. If we get rid of all of the criminals, everyone will be safe and the whole problem will be solved, right? Maya shook her head. Too hard. Too many people, and if we anger everyone, we won't be able to take on the entire carnivore population. And some of them don't deserve death. A few have only committed minor felonies, like stealing or shoplifting, and those aren't exactly punishable by death. Then I think we should hide, Ruby amended. I think you'll be in too much danger if you go back to your job. Maya ran a hand through her messy blue hair. It's a risk I'm willing to take. If I go into hiding now, we're never going to be able to gather enough evidence on them. And like I said, I think Donig is going to reconsider his strategy after this attempt. Whatever you think is best, Maya, Ruby said. I'll follow you wherever you go. Maya laughed. A little creepy, but that's nice to know. The room grew colder as the warmth from the stove faded. Maya began to shiver despite the blankets on top of them. I think it's time to go to bed, Maya said, getting up. It's way too cold in here for me. Ruby yawned, nodding. What about the other prisoners? Should we release them now? Maya wrapped the blanket around herself. Nah, I'm going to see if we can pry some more information out of them. That can't possibly be all they know. And why'd they even listen to Donig, anyway? Have you seen them before? Ruby shook her head. Never. And they weren't really good at fighting, were they? Yeah, they weren't particularly skilled. The wolf couldn't even use his swords properly, and he relied too much on blocking instead of evading. They reached the bathroom and closed the door behind themselves. Maya applied toothpaste to her brush as she talked, Ruby doing the same. With the blizzard outside, I don't think we're going anywhere for at least a day. Ruby made a muffled noise of protest. Okay, you might be fine. But we need to guard the prisoners and take them on bathroom breaks and feed them, and I'll need another hand here in case they try to escape. Ruby mused thoughtfully as she rinsed out her mouth. Wait, what are you going to eat? Maya froze mid-brush. Crap, she said, spitting out her toothpaste. I guess you'll need to make a supply run after all. I can't risk being weak while we're in charge of these prisoners. No big deal, Ruby said, splashing her face with water. I can go now if you're hungry. She shook her head, grabbing a towel. Thanks, but sleep is more important. Sleep deprivation is a lot more crippling than a little hunger. You'd be better off going during daylight so you don't get lost in the storm. As they walked into her bedroom, Maya continued to berate herself. I can't believe I forgot. What was I thinking? Don't worry, I forget things all the time, Ruby assured her, stripping off her jeans and bloody t-shirt before sliding into bed. That doesn't really help, Rose. Maya said this wryly, but she smiled anyways. She took off her casual clothes and pulled on thin cotton nightgown as Ruby watched, instantly drooling when she caught a glimpse of Maya's lean stomach. Good night, Rose, Maya said, turning off the dust lantern. Ruby breathed in the rabbit's scent as she pulled the covers up around her. Night, Maya.